So we're going to talk about economic and trade policy, and trade obviously big priority for you guys. So let's just give us, though, to start off, what's the big picture of Trump economic policy from your guys' perspective? What's good, what's bad?
This administration has done some genuinely good and really bordering on great things that have helped get this economy moving again. The tax cuts and tax reform, which he signed into law, absolutely launched the economic recovery. It was the president himself really who insisted on getting that corporate rate down. He was calling for 15%. He ended up settling for 21%. But without his leadership, I think the corporate rate would have crept back up as they were doing other giveaways in the legislation. So he deserves a lot of credit for that. And then the way his administration has consistently eliminated the barrier of red tape and regulation that has choked off job creation for decades in many cases in both kinds of administrations, Republicans and Democrats. It's been nothing short of incredible what it's done. So those two things are great. You look at the Veterans Administration reform. That was once in a generation genuine reform, which helps veterans and starts peeling away at some of the protected status of VA employees who fail our veterans. We think certainly the effort to get energy production moving again in this country, he's been a big supporter of that. That's been a crucial part of this economic recovery as well. So there's a lot there to like from what the administration has done.
So what don't you like?
Well, the trade and the tariff protections are really bad. It harkens back to a bad era of populism. You think about the economic impact of these tariffs, and it's been substantial. In fact, the tariffs, and not just with China, but the steel tariffs, which have had a ripple effect across this economy, they are absolutely undermining, to an extent, the economic recovery we're seeing because of the administration and Congress's tax cuts and reform, and then this administration's efforts to get regulation under control. It's undermining that, and we're seeing that.
So the way I've looked at it a little bit, and maybe this is too much of an excuse, but at least for some period of time, I don't know when this runs out, it's still a net tax cut, right? You have this enormous tax cut, and then you've had tariffs, which are basically another form of tax at some lower level. But that might not be true forever.
There's no question the tax cuts and tax reform have had a bigger savings than the tax increases under the tariff. I would agree with that. But it is, I believe, undermining economic growth. We just got the numbers out for last year's growth. It's just a hair under 3%. We were on track at one point last year for above 3%, which is that threshold that so many folks are really hoping to get to. There's no question that these tariffs have played a role. I'll just give one or two quick examples, if I could.
Yep.
Ford Motor Company ended up paying $1.1 billion last year, more money for the steel and aluminum that goes in their cars and trucks. And when you actually, and this wasn't our research, it was another group that did the research, but when you look at the cost in profit sharing to factory workers, it amounted to about $750 to $1,000 per factory floor worker in lost profit sharing. And these, again, aren't the executives making the big bucks. These are folks on the factory floor. So that's the big guys hurting, but also you've got companies like one in my home state of South Carolina, the knife company there. They've had to lay off 14 employees, small business, as they've seen their sales dramatically plummet because of the increased prices of steel, which obviously is a key component of their knives. So it hurts small businesses, and it does hurt big businesses. And last number I'll mention, the best estimates are that the steel tariffs cost around 200,000 American jobs last year. That's a sizable number. And, Rich, it's more than the total number of Americans employed by the steel industry.
Yeah, this is what seems bizarre about the steel tariffs. And it just seems as though some people in the administration just have a obsession or nostalgia about steel. Whereas if you're the blue-collar president and you want to help create manufacturing jobs in this country, steel is an input that manufacturers need to use to make stuff with American workers.
That's exactly right. And I think about the energy side of our economy, which I mentioned just a minute ago. I was in Houston, Texas, with a group of Americans for Prosperity activists last week, and they were pointing out that that energy, oil and natural gas pipeline cost and rig production cost, which the number one ingredient, steel, are up about 30%, which is impacting the number of jobs and the productivity of the biggest booming part of our economy, which is energy. And the last thing I'll mention here, the president rightly ran on draining the swamp, and that's a good thing. And he's done a lot of that, by the way. Getting rid of a lot of the regulation has done that. But to date, we've had over 43,000 requests from American companies for exemptions from just the steel tariffs. Now, is there some formula that lets you pick, which ones get the exemptions or not? No. That's up to the whim of individual bureaucrats. In other words, the companies that hire the best lawyers, the best lobbyists, that maybe make the best political contributions, they get fair and uneven treatment to get those exemptions. And the ones that don't have those connections, Rich, they don't get them. That's not draining the swamp. It's government picking winners and losers. And that's not a good thing for anyone. I know that's not the intent of this. I know that. But it is an outcome. Protectionism and tariffs leads to government cronyism. It just does.
And is the rationale, remind me, I lost the thread on this a while ago, but is the rationale on the steel tariffs national security? That's
what the president says. But when you look, and this is the Department of Defense's own numbers, they estimate that only 3% of the current American steel capacity is needed for national security, ships, tanks, that kind of thing, just 3%. So in the end, that's not really the answer. And what we're calling for is the bicameral trade legislation that Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania has put forward, which is very simple. It would just say that any administration, this one or any in the future, that proposed unilateral tariffs, the Congress would have 60 days in which to vote up or down on them. No filibuster allowed in the Senate, so you get an honest vote on it in the future on these. And we think that's a reasonable thing to do. Also, constitutionally, Congress is supposed to have a role in this area along with the executive branch.
So let me push you on two things, sort of devil's advocate, although the first one I'm quite sympathetic to, as we've discussed in the past. So China cheats, not a free trade country, steals our intellectual property, all sorts of overcapacity in various ways directed by the government. Government buttresses all sorts of industry there and concerns. And people feel as though, past administrations, Democrat and Republican, have just sort of taken it. And you need Trump to take the 2x4 in the form of tariffs or whatever else and to whack them upside the head to have some hope of getting progress and a more free trade-oriented solution out of China.
It is maddening to see a country like China that will take intellectual property of American companies and in many cases just steal it. However, if you use tariffs as leverage to try and stop that, you're creating that leverage on the backs of innocent American farmers, soybean farmers, wheat farmers, pork producers, all of whom are hurting badly with the current situation with China. You're accruing that leverage on the backs of American consumers. American consumers, usually fixed incomes, folks that are not rolling in cash. By making the products they buy at a Walmart or a Target or a Dollar General more expensive because of the tariffs on goods coming in from places like China. So you're creating leverage on the backs of tens of millions of innocent Americans. And that's not the way to do it. And there's also a danger, Rich, when you conflate trade policy with other issues like intellectual property theft. The two are different issues. And that's a dangerous thing to do. I noticed in the renegotiation of NAFTA, which is important to do because it's time to go ahead and upgrade or modernize NAFTA, which is an agreement that's 2.5 decades old. And the current work to do that actually does some important things, like on the e-commerce side of things. That wasn't even really around 2.5 decades ago. They needed to do that. However, the NAFTA renewal also is conflating, in this case, labor law and minimum wage with trade. And it's best to keep those are apples to oranges. It's best to keep the two separated, to pursue intellectual property integrity separately from trade, because if you bring the two together, you're gaining leverage for those companies who are losing intellectual property potentially, but you're doing it with tens of millions of innocent Americans. And that's not the right way to do it.
Okay, so how about
That's a long-winded answer. I
Sure,
forget,
that was
but that's a really nuanced question.
It's responsive. I ask nuanced questions.
That's
Tim.
true.
Okay.
You do.
So how about the argument, we'll call it for simplicity's sake, the Tucker Carlson argument, which is, okay, maybe, Tim, you're right about the effects of trade in the aggregate in general. But there have been communities that have been hurt by this specifically, and people who have been hurt by free trade specifically, a class of working class men who, because their wages have been stagnant or have gone down, are less marriageable or therefore less connected to their communities, therefore are subjected to all sorts of horrific social ills that we all know about. So this, I don't care if it's helping, financiers in New York or there's some other community that's being helped by it. The fact that these people are being hurt so much is an indictment that the free trade regime can't sustain.
Yeah. There is, in the end, no question that trade causes some displacement. There's no way around that. I grew up in a little town called Lyman, South Carolina, Rich. And that town, Lyman, was named after the local textile mill, Lyman Mill. I lived on a mill village, literally. My mom went to the factory every day, or it was really a textile mill every day, and as did her brothers. And at a point in the late 70s, Malaysian and Indonesian textiles simply wiped out the American textile business, at least in the South. And my mom lost her job. My uncles lost a job. Lyman Mill, which was literally the town I grew up in, closed down. You can imagine the devastation that it caused across upstate South Carolina. Now, our nation had a choice. We could have used protectionism to prop up and protect some of those jobs, but it would have been a false prosperity. And in the end, when those mills went away, it forced South Carolina, my hometown, my flesh and blood, to innovate and look for other ways. And today, upstate South Carolina, which is a beacon for the car industry, has been able to bring in BMW and so many ancillary businesses. It's far more prosperous today. So the benefits of free trade are more broadly dispersed to a wider number of people. When a family on a fixed income goes into Dollar General and they pay a lot less money for the basic products they need every day, that is a dispersed benefit of free trade. It's hard to see that. It's hard to go into Dollar General and go, thank goodness I've got free trade. I've saved $40 a day, $40 I badly need. But the pain that is caused, and there's no question there's pain when a factory closes down, and when my mom's textile mill when I was a little boy shut down, it is more intensified. But the pain of a soybean farmer, and I've been on these soybean farms out in the Midwest and the Plain States, because their crop, their market in China has been wiped out by these tariffs, Rich, it's just as painful and just as hurtful to that soybean farmer who is a victim of this tariff and trade war with China as it is for someone who also has been badly hurt when their factory or business closed down. There's going to be pain on different sides, and you never want to see it. I would never be cavalier because I've experienced it in my own family growing up, and it hurts. But the benefits of trade are far more broadly dispersed, and sometimes they're harder to see. Okay.
So before we wrap up, something that's certainly true, whatever you think of the intellectual arguments or the policy arguments, certainly true that you go into a room of conservatives now, and things you would say about free trade, 10, 20, certainly 30 years ago, and generally you'd get nods of assent. That's not the reaction anymore. So how are you guys undertaking the intellectual spade work to recover the free trade consensus that once defined the party?
I do see that on a consistent basis across the broader movement. And also if I'm at a group of Republican activists or primary voters. You're exactly right. I see the same thing that you're seeing. I think it's a long-term effort to explain the virtues and the benefits that come with trade. The lower cost across the board for just about every product we buy, the greater choice that people have, whether it's in buying a flat screen TV, something near and dear to my heart when March Madness rolls around, or the Super Bowl, or whether it's any other number of products. And the way that in the end, our economy is intertwined with the world's economy. It just is. I think that's actually a good thing. We have a greater number of choices for everything from the fruit we eat. When I was a little kid, and I'm older than you, obviously, but you had berries in season only for the time period they were in season in the American South. Now you go to Costco, they're there year round. That may sound like a small thing, but it's not.
Yeah,
I mean,
we had watermelon last night.
Yeah,
it's just in the middle of winter.
And one last thing, and I tell crowds this: there is no such thing as a perfect marriage. I'm close. I've got a perfect wife. Don't get me wrong, but there is no such thing as a perfect marriage. There is no such thing as perfect free trade. That's true. America, we have big sugar tariffs to the rest of the world, and that's not good. Whereas other countries, China, Japan, Europe, they've got tariffs they shouldn't have. But if we waited for perfection, we would never have trade. We would never have the free exchange of goods that's lifted so many people in the United States and the world, but especially here in the United States, up to a higher standard of living and to better lives.
And tell us a little bit about Trade Builds America.
Well, Trade Build America is a coalition that we are out there with that is seeking to make the case that hopefully I just made on trade. And we do think it's a long-term effort, having conversations. And one thing I've learned from this, I remember the Reagan years as a young activist, and Reagan was a free trade leader. And it took a long time, and then to Newt Gingrich and some in the Democrat Party in the 90s, Bill Clinton, they put together NAFTA. And I thought by the early 2000s there was a broad consensus, at least among Republicans and folks in the conservative movement, that trade was a good thing. And I think we fell asleep a little bit, Rich, in continuing to explain why it's a good thing. And it eroded. And this happened well before the current administration. There are many Republicans and conservative thought leaders that were drifting to protectionism, Patrick Buchanan and others. And we let it drift without answering. So to an extent, shame on us. Those days are over. This trade coalition and other groups, we're out there explaining, again, the virtues and the good effects on everyday folks that trade and the free exchange of goods across this world brings.
Great. Tim, thanks so much for being with us.